Carl DeBrodie was reported missing on April 17th from an assisted living facility. He had a mental disability and limited communication skills.
This podcast contains adult content.
Second Chance Homes is where Carl was staying at the time of his disappearance last April. He was later found dead inside a storage facility there.
The death of 31-year-old Carl DeBrodie remains a mystery. Almost a year later, and no arrests have been made.
Nearly a year later, and still no one is taking responsibility for the death of 31-year-old Carl DeBrodie.
Welcome to the James Chambers Show. I'm your host for this podcast, James Chambers. This is a special edition of the James Chambers Show. Up until now, this program has predominantly focused on social issues and politics with silliness kind of sprinkled in for good measure, but today's show is a little different. Today, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true crime story. Nothing has been fabricated, nothing is embellished, just the facts as they have been reported by law enforcement and the media. It's a story of a broken family, a failed system, corruption, slave labor, and violence. And it begins like this. Over a year ago, a mentally handicapped man was reported missing from an assisted living facility in my community. His body was discovered a week later, but nothing added up. Nothing made sense. But now we know through court filings what really happened to Carl Lee DeBrodie. And just a warning, some of the elements of this story are disturbing. Carl DeBrodie was born in 1985 to Carolyn Summers. Carl was developmentally disabled, legally blind, and possibly autistic. Summers herself was severely intellectually, psychologically, socially, and occupationally impaired. Two of Summers' children had been removed from the home and adopted, but Carl remained in the home until 1999. Carl's parents were mentally and physically abusive, and this has been corroborated by family members of the DeBrodies. So, at age 13, Carl was legally removed from the home and sent to live with a guardian, Mary Martin, who had been his childhood bus driver and was active in the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. Mary and her husband, to their credit, did well by Carl, and he thrived. Carl never needed medication while under their care, and he was able to appropriately use the bathroom. Again, he was thriving. Mary Martin remembers Carl as a young man who just wanted to be happy, who never hurt anyone. The Martins also allowed him to see his biological family often, along with the help of Carl's aunt, Carol Sampson, which made Carl visibly pleased. But then, things took a turn for the worse. At 18, Carl aged out of the guardianship system. The Martins' requests to remain Carl's legal guardian were rejected by the Missouri Court of Appeals several times, but they still supported him until he was 21 years old. In 2007, Carl moved from Mrs. Martin's home to an independent living facility. He began a job working at Kingdom Projects, which is a sheltered workshop for adults with developmental disabilities. But sadly, within a year, he was again living with his biological mother, Carolyn Summers. In 2008, Carl's guardian ad litem, which is a court-appointed temporary guardian, met with Miss Summers at her home and afterward expressed worry about the mental and physical well-being of Carl. He was chain-smoking and just pacing and pacing and pacing, she reported to the court later. So the Circuit Court of Callaway County appointed Public Administrator Karen Dye Allen as Carl's legal guardian. Carl became one of Allen's 150 open guardianship cases. At the same time, Mary Martin's request to become Carl's legal guardian was rejected yet again, and by 2010, he was living in a care facility called Second Chance Homes. Carl's life would never be the same. In court testimony and just in general, Second Chance Homes seemed, totally normal, even boring. It was said to be a completely normal-looking family home. Hell, Carl kicked smoking and even began to learn how to feed cattle. But Martin wasn't so sure that everything was as idyllic and safe as everyone seemed to believe. While Carl was visiting over Christmas of 2010, Martin took photographs of him showing multiple injuries, bruised ears, bruises to his body, black eyes. Martin reported her findings to Carl's guardian ad litem, but she dismissed his injuries as understandable consequences of working outside. To be precise, Carl's injuries were, quote, more likely caused by Carl bumping into things outdoors. So, Mary Martin called the abuse hotline for the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services. Again, nothing was done. Indeed, the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services claimed that no such report even existed. But something did change. After the hotline call, Mary Martin was cut off from Carl DeBrodie. The Second Chance facility wouldn't allow her to speak with Carl on the phone, and many times they would just hang up on her or not answer at all. Before being cut off from Carl, Martin also noted that DeBrodie seemed heavily medicated and began wearing adult diapers, which he had never done before. In 2011, Martin and her husband attempted a last-ditch effort to adopt Carl by petitioning the Cole County Circuit Court, but they were again rejected. Twice. Mary Beck, DeBrodie's ad litem for the court during the adoption case, even recommended granting the adoption as it was clear that the Martins and Carl's biological family were very important to his mental and emotional well-being, ultimately to no avail. The public administrator overseeing DeBrodie's case, Second Chance Homes, and the Callaway County Special Services, among others, managed to block the adoption, citing concerns that the Martins couldn't create a stable enough environment for someone with Carl's needs. All the while, Carl's situation was escalating. During the adoption proceedings, Mary and her lawyer met with him at Second Chance Homes, but Carl wouldn't make eye contact with her. He wouldn't speak with her, and as she reports later, when he was around certain employees, he wouldn't acknowledge her at all. Through no lack of good intent, the court system made Carl's life worse. What they didn't know was that by blocking the adoption, by blocking the guardianship of the Martins, by keeping Carl DeBrodie in Second Chance Homes, the system that was supposed to protect him killed him instead. We should take a moment here to talk about Second Chance Homes of Fulton, LLC. Second Chance was a small network of group homes, more specifically individualized supported living homes. After the disappearance of DeBrodie, several investigations from the Callaway County Special Services Department were launched. Concurrent to that, the Missouri Department of Mental Health also launched several investigations into the care being provided by Second Chance. Specifically, there were 3 allegations made by clients, including 2 accusations of being left unattended due to lack of staff, and 1 accusation of repeated assault. These new allegations and investigations are not outliers. According to Special Services, Second Chance Homes had 18 incidents of noncompliance between September of 2016 and February of 2017. During that time, they didn't submit their monthly provider reviews. During that same time frame, Second Chance failed to submit 17 registered nurse reviews of clients living in their homes. And just remember that time frame. We'll come back to that. Although this pattern of poor management seems unsettling, what is more telling is the 265 issues reported by Special Services between 2012 and 2017, including failure to file monthly provider review documents, registered nurse reviews of clients, daily notes that were missing for review, and probably the most telling problem, service monitoring not being completed due to cancellation by Second Chance Homes. When asked about the investigations, the administrator of Second Chance, Rachel Rowden, simply said, "I'm aware of the investigations. I can't answer any questions yet." Carl Lee DeBrodie was reported missing on April 17, 2017. Someone at Second Chance called the Fulton police at 7:31 a.m. and reported that DeBrodie had left the facility on foot and had not returned. Carl's safety was paramount due to his mental disability and his difficulty in communicating. 1 week later, after an extensive search and rescue effort, DeBrodie was found. He was found inside a City of Fulton trash can that had been placed in a wooden box, encased in concrete, and left in a locked storage unit at Moore's Easy Storage in Fulton. The investigators quickly determined that DeBrodie had been locked in his tomb longer than just 1 week. He had died sometime between the end of October and the end of November of 2016, almost 6 months before he was reported missing by Second Chance Homes. In another odd twist, the day of the missing persons call, that very day, Second Chance Homes was to be acquired by a new company, Fink & Associates. This new company hadn't actually seen any patient files yet. They didn't know that a resident had simply disappeared. So Second Chance fabricated a cover story. Carl was missing. But why and how did all this fit together? As it is with the media, after Carl's body was discovered and no flashy arrests were made, the media attention just slowly faded. The news cycle spun on. We had a new president to worry about. After all, the mob-like hit of a local disabled autistic guy found in a block of cement in a storage unit can only hold the interest of the community for so long, right? Investigations were conducted, the state got involved, and the family of Carl DeBrodie filed a lawsuit naming 24 defendants, including state, local, and county administrators and employees of Second Chance Homes. But that is not the end. Not by a long shot. In May of 2018, just a week ago now, and nearly a year after the discovery of Carl's body, we now know what happened to Carl Lee DeBrodie. Carl's mental and physical condition began to deteriorate. He had been cut off from his family, his prior guardians, and, as we now know, he was not getting face-to-face time with county guardians charged to ensure his well-being. What happened to this deeply troubled and vulnerable man?
New court documents released this morning reveal the 31-year-old mentally disabled man was forced into fight clubs. The 62 pages of court documents claim that DeBrodie's nurses and guardian neglected him, missing all the signs that he was being tortured.
Marika, a court document outlines Carl DeBrodie's tortured final days, forced into fistfights, sleeping on a basement floor, and his body riddled with bruises and broken bones.
Today we learned a former employee of Second Chance claimed a client confessed to murdering someone there.
They say Sherry Paolo, manager of Second Chance's Homes, would take DeBrodie to her own home, then force DeBrodie to fight other residents for other people to watch.
The group home and its owner, Rachel Rowden, had until today to respond to the wrongful death lawsuit filed by DeBrodie's biological mother. But in the legal response, they're not taking any of the blame for DeBrodie's death, instead putting it on him and his family.
Sherry Paolo, a qualified developmental disabilities professional at Second Chance, and her husband, Anthony Flores, also an employee of Second Chance, began taking Carl and another resident known only as Resident 1 to their personal home in Fulton. There, the men would be forced to do what amounts to be slave labor at Paolo's home. Often they would be kept in their private residence overnight and held in a basement with no mattresses, no blankets, no pillows, nothing at all, only the concrete slab of the floor. Paolo and Flores would often make Carl and Resident 1 bare-knuckle fight for the amusement of their family. And at the time of his death, Carl had serious injuries including at least 6 broken ribs, black eyes, and deep contusions and bruising. Finally, the abuse was too much for his increasingly frail body, and one night between October 25th and November 24th of 2016, Flores was awakened by Carl's screams. Carl was convulsing on the concrete basement floor, bleeding from his nose and his mouth. Instead of calling 911 or initiating life-saving measures, Flores placed DeBrodie in the bathtub upstairs, turned on the shower, and left him. Carl died in that tub. His body stayed there for 2 days before being moved. He was then shoved in a City of Fulton garbage can, placed in a wooden box, encased in concrete, and hidden away in that storage unit. The monstrous behavior of Paolo and Flores is abhorrent and morally repugnant, but how did things spiral so far out of control? If Carl was so physically damaged, surely someone would have seen it. Well, the short answer is, yeah. DeBrodie's case manager would have absolutely seen his increasingly frail and battered body. Had she actually seen him face to face? Here's what the family lawsuit states. For several months leading up to Carl's reported disappearance, the defendants prevented his family from seeing or visiting with Carl. Defendant Tiffany Kep, Callaway County Special Service Support Coordinator, and defendant Melissa DeLapp, the registered nurse who worked for the Department of Mental Health, though obligated to make face-to-face contact with Carl and to document said interactions, failed to do so. Instead of conducting the mandated face-to-face contact, Defendant Kipp drafted and submitted false reports indicating that face-to-face contact had been made. Instead of conducting the mandated face-to-face contact and health evaluations, Defendant DeLapp drafted and submitted false reports indicating that face-to-face contact had in fact been made. Several months elapsed without face-to-face contact between Carl and his state and local support staff, and yet there were reports being filed claiming that face-to-face contact with Carl had in fact occurred in October, November, and December of 2016, and January, February, and March of 17. Every month, a falsified report was filed up until April, the month Carl went missing. The last time that any of Carl's prescription medication had been filled was August of 2016, the last time that Tiffany Kipp and the last time that Melissa DeLapp had a face-to-face contact with Carl DeBrodie was September of 2016. Had any of Carl DeBrodie's caregivers done their job, from the staff at Second Chance Homes to the state healthcare provider to the local support coordinator and any of their superiors, Carl might be alive today. Had the court allowed a loving family to retain guardianship or even adopt Carl, he may be alive today. Carl DeBrodie was a deeply afflicted, mentally disabled, and highly vulnerable man whose life was tragically cut short due to the failure of every support structure designed to help him live a decent life. He was cut down by greed, incompetence, negligence, neglect, and violence, and he didn't have the capacity to fight for himself, to protect himself. So he died alone in a bathtub, convulsing and bleeding, far outside the reach of everyone who cared for him. While writing and researching this episode, something else happened in the case of Carl Lee DeBrodie. Up until yesterday, the day prior to this recording, no arrests had been made, no charges had been filed, but that has now changed. In a statement last night by the Fulton Police Department and the Callaway County Sheriff's Office, 5 people have been arrested and are being detained in connection to the death of Carl DeBrodie. Sherry K. Paulo, 53, was charged with client neglect, first-degree involuntary manslaughter, abandonment of a corpse, and 2 counts of making a false report. Anthony R. Flores, 58, was charged with client neglect, first-degree involuntary manslaughter, abandonment of a corpse, and 2 counts of making a false report. Anthony R.K. Flores, 32, was charged with 2 counts of making a false report, and Shayna A. Osborne, 29, and Mary K. Paulo, 34, were each charged with making a false report. Other charges or arrests are possible, as the prosecuting attorney Christopher Wilson points out. As part of our ongoing cooperation and discussion with federal prosecutors, I have agreed not to pursue certain state criminal charges against these defendants as well as other suspects in the investigation to avoid interference with any federal criminal charges related to healthcare fraud that may be brought by the U.S. Department of Justice. The gears of justice grind slowly, and certainly they falter and ultimately fail at times, but sometimes they move the machine in the right direction, too. The sad case of Carl DeBrodie is evidence that even in the rural South, justice is possible, and we can all rest a little easier for it. Thank you for listening to the What Really Happened to Carl D. episode of The James Chambers Show. This episode includes reporting and audio from the Fulton Sun, the Columbia Tribune, the Kansas City Star, the Jefferson City News Tribune, KRCG News, KMIZ News, and KOMU News. All sources are used under the Fair Use Doctrine. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the comments section below. Email the show at realjcshow2017, that's realjcshow2017@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter at realjcshow. If you have a friend or a family member who is developmentally disabled or otherwise vulnerable to abuse, don't wait to check up on them. I've dropped a couple of links in the description box to sites offering support and education regarding parents and children with disabilities. Thank you all for listening. Talk to you next time.